Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry we had to have a slightly shorter coffee break because of the exciting panel that we just heard. And we have another one for you, all about freight. Why bother about freight? It's not a topic we've discussed enough today, over the last while, so it's great to have this panel. I'm going to invite Laetitia de Blanc. She's a director of research at the French Institute of Science and Technology for Transport, and she is also part of one of the two centers of excellence on freight that the Volvo Research and Education Foundations have just started to fund. So we're really delighted to have them join this wonderful community of ours. So Laetitia, I'm going to invite you to start the panel. And
okay.
We'll go from there.
Thank you very much, Jackie. And the good news is we have 10 more minutes, so we should try to finish by, we will finish by 12:40 instead of 12:30. And I also hope we have a good discussion with the audience before finishing the session. I will let the panel members introduce themselves. First, just one word about our session objectives. So why bother about urban freight? Well, there are 1 million deliveries in the city I work in and I actually live in, which is the Paris region. 1 million deliveries a day. And this 1 million covers extremely diverse operations, types of trips, companies, types of vehicles, types of hours of services, of jobs. And this is maybe this diversity we will want to emphasize and discuss today. And a second, very briefly, thing I want to introduce is urban freight is very much related to the demand, as many other activities, but probably in our case, and compared with other urban activities, the demand for urban freight actually completely dominates the way urban freight as a transport activity will respond. Urban freight as a transport activity will adapt, will respond to the very changing demand, very diverse demand for deliveries in cities. It's a very flexible sector. There are very bad sides about that also, and we will discuss the assets and the costs of this activity. But we really want to emphasize in this discussion this flexibility to a very changing, always changing demand for goods in cities and the great adaptation of that sector. So just before asking the panel members to introduce themselves, I also want to mention we will have two discussants. So Alison Conway from City College of New York and Michael Brown from the University of Westminster and also from the Gothenburg Urban Freight Platform. And as Jackie mentioned, the three of us are part of the Volvo Foundation's new Centers for Urban Freight. And I want to take this opportunity to thank VRF for actually implementing these two new centers on urban freight. It's been great so far to work with my colleagues from Metro Freight, which is my center, and Alison's center. It's also been great to work with the other colleagues from the other center, and we've established a very good, I think, cooperative activity. And that also leads me to mention that Metro Freight and the leader of Metro Freight, which is Metrons in California, has a conference on urban freight coming up. That's October 2015 in Long Beach, California. It's every other 2 years. It's a very good opportunity, and we are inviting all of you to think about coming to the next conference, which will take place again in October next year. Thank you. So please, panel members, can you briefly introduce themselves? And then we start the questions and the debate.
Okay, first? Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Joe Dack. I'm a transport and logistics project manager with a company called HDR. And HDR is an engineering consultancy, and we get to work on some fantastic projects throughout the US. My background is very much transport and logistics focused. I've worked in a number of different operations, including humanitarian logistics, moving mail around, and operational logistics for retailers. But in 2005, I joined Transport for London, and at that time, TfL was looking at developing its first freight plan, and so I was very lucky to be involved in that. And since I've come to New York, I've been in New York for nearly 2 years. I've had the opportunity to work with Stacey and the Office of Freight Mobility here, and it's a very unique experience in terms of understanding the different freight dynamics between London as a city and New York as a city.
Hi, I'm Andrew Gann. I'm the Senior Vice President for Ports and Transportation at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. New York City EDC is a public benefit corporation that began in 1991, and essentially we are the stewards of the city's freight transportation modes. So rail freight, seaports, and air cargo all fall under our domain. We have a group that focuses on all those modes, and we're really about promoting efficiency in the city's freight transportation system. Work very closely with Stacey. I like to say that this is sort of Stacey's game, and we play in it in many ways, because she's, she's our go-to person when we hit the streets, and helps us connect our terminals to the consuming region. And Joe, we just hired as one of our consultants, and I've known Howie now for about 20 years, so we have a freight ecology here on the stage today.
Thank you. My name is Stacey Hodge. I'm the director of the Office of Freight Mobility at New York City's Department of Transportation. My background is in civil engineering, and I got into planning in about 2007. I was given the opportunity to be the first director of the Office of Freight Mobility. So it's a young office, and we're tasked with trying to both provide safety and quality of life for the residents of New York. And I inherited truck routes that were put in over 20 years ago, which is a great benefit. So my job is to protect them, figure out where we might need to change, but for the most part, try to make sure we maintain a way to move goods through the city in a safe way.
Hi, everyone. I'm Howie Mann. I'm a transportation analyst, associate transportation analyst for the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, or otherwise known as NMTIC. We're the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the downstate 10-county region. And for the better part of about 15 years or so, I've been working in analyzing, evaluating, and planning for freight transportation for NMTIC. So I've had a lot of other experiences in terms of working with freight. I'm a graduate adjunct professor at Polytech, also teaching a graduate class in freight transportation. And I've had a great opportunity to work with Andrew and with a lot of other dedicated people on the establishment and the operation of a high school in New York City that functions to teach and train young people in logistics, supply chain, and freight. So it's a really exciting opportunity. It's good to be here today.
Hi everyone, I'm Nomesh Bolia. I am a faculty member in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at IIT Delhi. My basic training is in operations research, optimization, and the core areas of interest are transportation in general, not just freight, but transportation in general, as well as health systems. The reason why I'm here, I guess, is because VREF has been very kind to fund a project on urban freight at IIT Delhi. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them, as well as our RPI team who are working closely with us on the project. Thanks.
Thank you very much all. A lot of experience, and we'll have New York, London, Delhi, and as examples. That will be great. We, as a panel, we suggest to organize the session with 3 questions, main sets of questions. Can I have the slide with the questions? Just for the audience briefly. So we'll first have a set of questions about assets and costs. What's the situation of urban freight today? How can we define it? Do we have the data? What are the costs associated to that activity? And then we'll have Alison as a discussant after the first round of questions and comments from the panel. And then we'll have a second set of questions about the trends, the new trends of the demand on the one side, and also on the supply of urban freight, the new technologies or processes to actually achieve to comply with the demand. And Michael will be our discussant for that set of questions. And then the final set of questions will be about public policies and strategies, and Alison will be our discussant, and we'll finish with a more general comment from Michael for ending the session and going to the discussion with the audience. So just briefly introducing the first series of questions, and we want to know more from all of you what, in your sense, is the broader picture of urban freight, maybe the regional picture of urban freight. And relating directly to the question of the whole conference, does freight have good access to our cities and even to our buildings, maybe at another level of discussion? What are the costs of reaching cities to the freight industry? And also on the other side, what are the social costs associated with freight activities for the communities? Maybe I will start with Howie on these questions.
I think the rhetorical question behind this particular session is why should we care about freight, and why are we discussing it at a session like this, during an event like this, when I think it's safe to say previous to this panel, we were discussing the movement of people in transit, on roadways, and in general, when you think about transportation planning and research, and you look at agencies that are working on this kind of research, the focus generally has been predominantly on the movement of people. There's a body of knowledge out there that focuses pretty much almost entirely on passenger transport, either on rail or on highways, but it's beginning to become evident in the country, in the nation, and around the world that the movement of the things that support society is becoming just about as important, or maybe even more important than the movement of ourselves. And I think that's one of the reasons why this particular panel is important. It's important for us to be here to discuss this, but I think as a second objective, it's important for us to be up here to sort of make a case, if you will, to help prioritize the needs of freight transportation. We, all of us on this panel, work pretty much every day on trying to understand more about what this movement is all about, why it's important, what are the challenges and the issues surrounding the movement of the stuff, as I call it, that we need on an everyday basis. So just to focus just for a minute to bring this down to the regional level, and as I said at the outset, the organization I work for is a regional organization. And so we look at the region, and that's 10 counties. We've got about 12 million people residing in about 2,400 square miles. So that's a lot of people living in a pretty small area. We're actually one of the most densely settled regions almost anywhere in the world. And Manhattan, I believe, is probably the most densely settled area in the world itself. I don't think there are too many other areas that are where people live and work and play that close together. But so there's a lot of people living in a small area, and all of these 12 million people have a need for lots and lots of things, most of which is kind of invisible to the rest of us. But if you think for a minute about what it was that you did when you came here today, you had a refreshment break, and there was all this food out there. It was all prepared. I'm willing to bet that nobody probably gave it a thought as to where it came from, how it got here, what its origin was, and the odds are the origin is a multiple of places, not just nationally, but internationally as well. And that's why the issue of freight is discussed on an international basis. We have people here from all other parts of the world because, as you know, this is a global economy. And what does a global economy mean with regard to freight transportation? It means that the origins and the destinations of all of these things are as diverse as you can imagine. So on a daily basis, all of these things, the clothes you wear, the furniture you use, the food you eat, is moving on an incredibly dynamic basis from all these places to all these other places. And what it breaks down to when you get down to the urban area or to the regional area is that the characteristics of a region become unique. So the characteristics of the region we work in, the New York downstate area, is very unique as compared to other international areas like London and Paris and cities in India, in South America. The panel before us had representatives from South America. There is a system in place around the world that helps to streamline and make efficient this movement of material all around the world on an everyday basis. There are people who work in this field on both the public and private side that make it happen. So what does all this mean for this particular region, breaking it down? It means these 12 million people are accepting goods and are also producing goods, if you want to use that term, and all of these things have to be moved and have to go someplace. So just as a way of introduction to the NIMTIC region, we are a consuming region, and that sets us apart from many other regions because we don't really produce that much stuff. You don't see a lot of raw materials coming into this region, but you see a lot of finished goods coming in, ready to be consumed or actually have already been consumed. So that sets us apart from the Chicago metropolitan area, the Detroit metropolitan area, the Los Angeles metropolitan area. Each of these regions and regions across the world have these unique characteristics that set them apart from all these other places. So we consume a lot of material. What does that mean? That means this stuff, whatever it is, refrigerators, TVs, whatever, is being produced someplace. And again, this is this global economy that we're talking about. This material is coming in someplace to our larger region, which is comprised of about 28 counties, which includes other metropolitan planning organizations. And all this stuff is coming off of a ship, or if it's national, it's coming off of a train or a truck. It's being broken down. It's going to a warehouse, maybe more than one warehouse, maybe to a distribution facility, somewhere totally outside of the NIMTIC region. And what that means is that the final transport of these goods, these finished goods that are destined to our residents or to our workers, needs a way to get into this very densely settled area. And so because of that, and because of a number of other reasons, another number of other factors, we have a very, very high reliance on trucks. It's over 90% of this material, of these goods that are coming in, are being moved by truck. There are a lot of reasons for that, and again, it's one of these things that makes this region very, very unique and sets it apart from other regions which are not so reliant on trucking because they are able to take advantage of many other modes of transport, again, for a lot of reasons. So if you look at the national statistic, about 30% of the stuff that gets moved to the country as a whole is moved by rail. In this region, it's about 2%. So there are a lot of things going on in terms of infrastructure, our institutional arrangements, how we finance and how we fund infrastructure and infrastructure's improvements. The very fact that this dependency is a burden to us is exemplified by the fact that traffic congestion, interestingly enough, is found on the very same roadways that are being used for passenger transport, and those roadways are suffering from most of the congestion that we find, because we've looked at this at NIMTIC through our congestion management process. And what we found is that the bottlenecks that are affecting passenger transport are affecting freight transport as well. So there are a lot of challenges that we need to focus on, certainly on the operational side, but on the infrastructure side as well. Just to focus on two, we found that bridge deficiencies just so happen are on the network that freight transport is reliant on. Also, pavement needs, and some of the most pavement needs are also on the same transportation network, highway network, that our freight transportation is dependent on as well. So again, these are some of the challenges that we face. And just to keep this also in focus is, what do you do to keep an economy like the economy in the NIMTIC region moving? The gross regional product for the NIMTIC region is about $1.3 trillion a year. What does it take to sustain that economy? What does it take to keep it going without getting it bogged down? And by bogging down, by having delay, by having congestion, which are some of these the issues that we face, it translates to cost. Ultimately, there's a translation to cost. Anecdotally, not scientifically, we've looked at this and we've found that, and I know some of my colleagues probably know this, but the cost to move a truckload of goods from west of the Hudson River, from say New Jersey to the NIMTIC region, is about the same cost as it is to move the same truckload of material, whatever it is, from New Jersey, from a distribution facility or warehouse, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So that kind of helps frame the issue. The other way in which this
Sorry,
is an issue.
this was a feedback from one of the truck companies you were talking with?
Yeah, exactly, yes. Yeah, again, this is anecdotal and this requires some scientific substantiation,
yes.
but
we should work on that.
Yeah, we know for a fact that it costs more in a freight sense to do business in this region than it does in other regions because of all these other factors.
And are they telling you, for example, in your freight working group, that it's getting worse, or no? Because they are used to managing these new conditions all the time.
We've conducted some focus groups several times, both for our original freight plan, as well as some technical studies that we've done, including our feasibility of freight villages work and others. So we've had one-on-one freight group sessions with carriers, not so much with shippers and receivers, although we want to reach out to them, but mostly with the carriers themselves. And you get great feedback from the carriers. And when I say great, I mean it's valuable, but it's also very negative. And they're telling us that this is a very, very hard region to do business in.
Well, I'd like to hear about Andrew's experience on this issue.
I think Howie's hitting the nail on the head, especially about this being densely populated. I live in a one-bedroom with 4 people, and I can tell you it's quite dense on the Upper West Side. But kidding aside, there's the paradox about New York. New York was founded as a trading area, by the Dutch, and evolved into the greatest seaport in the United States. And over time, even though a lot of the cargo has shifted west to New Jersey in terms of the seaport activity, there is still a huge amount of freight that moves through the New York region, through New York City itself, about 400 million tons annually, and that's from Howie's report. So managing that, it used to be a big deal. When RPA was founded, you read the old RPA reports, it was all about how do we promote commerce, how do we move freight, and they had all these intricate charts showing every move of a railroad or every move of a barge in New York Harbor. It was a big deal. How do you decongest, the urban core? And we really haven't changed very much since those days. We talk about the same issues. But what I think is interesting and why EDC is so involved in this is because freight is an industry unto itself. And it still is big business in New York City. We have, certainly Wall Street, the insurance industries, they all grew up because of managing freight. That was those were, the founding of sort of the stock exchange was just a few blocks from South Street Seaport because people were sort of trading on companies that were involved in freight transportation. And New York innovated in terms of direct sailings to France and England from Lower Manhattan. And so I think there's this sense of, and of course the Erie Canal. So we grew up on freight, and there's a whole industry around it. And in New York, that means, in the maritime industry, we have about 30,000 direct jobs working on the water. And a lot of people don't realize that, every large Panamax, post-Panamax vessel that comes into New York Harbor is going to be served by 1 or 2 tugboats that are based in New York City, whether it's on the Staten Island waterfront or in Brooklyn. They're getting, they're getting served by a New York company. New York is also the largest petroleum terminal in the United States. 18 billion gallons of fuel move through the port of New York. At the same time, we have some of the largest ship repair industry in New York, and that all goes into sort of an economic multiplier that is far higher than what you see for a service sector industry. The other thing that we've learned in this business is that air cargo through JFK, which is really a function of the number of flights that go through that airport, continues to lead the United States in terms of the value of the goods that pass through JFK Airport. And that industry alone supports 50,000 jobs. And not only jobs in air cargo, but sort of the freight forwarder and customs broker industry in New York and New Jersey has a strong center point in the Springfield Gardens area around JFK, because the know-how and the intellectual capacity to do all this trade is still in New York. Even though we may not see it in our daily lives, it's still prevalent. And I think that's why it's important for us to manage freight. That's a challenge that makes our jobs a lot of fun and challenging, but it's also recognizing that this is not just a dinosaur industry, but it's actually an industry that's alive and well. So.
Yes, Howard?
I just want to close out the framing of the issue from the regional perspective. As I said, we have a population of about 12 million. The NIMTIC official forecasts are for a pretty big increase in population, about another 1 million people, and that's the consensus forecast that our members have agreed to. But what do you think that translates into? Andrew mentioned the forecast for the increase in the actual volume or tonnage of freight. That's about 46% up through 2040. But here's the real kicker, and that is, and then this is really the fodder for what we're going to talk about later, and that is while the freight volume is slated to increase by 46%, the value of the freight that's going to be moving and projected up through 2040 is going to increase by 77%.
Okay.
So if nothing else frames this discussion,
That's your work for the freight plan. Wow, interesting. What, on a more, going back to a more urban scale, for Stacy, what's urban freight for you? Okay. Do you have metrics? What is it in terms of cost for New Yorkers?
I will focus on why bother about urban freight.
Yeah.
Okay? So I am one of 4,500 people that work at DOT. So I don't do anything alone. We are managing a huge infrastructure. We have lots of bridges. We have traffic signals, roadways, all of which move both people and goods. And so why bother about freight? Because we're trying to add more bike lanes. We are trying to add bus rapid transit. And when we put in dedicated bike lanes and dedicated bus lanes next to the sidewalk, then you see why you should think about urban freight. Because before those ideas and those programs came on board, trucks were parking at the curb and making their deliveries. Now that we have to share space, we need to plan better. We need to have multimodal planning. We cannot have complete streets if we didn't think about freight. Okay, so Howie has said it already, about 99% of the goods, this is the last mile. That product could have started very far away. It may have started on an airplane and landed at JFK and then got on a truck, but it's coming to your local store. You are going to go to the grocery store and buy something. A truck is bringing it there. So if we don't accommodate for the truck deliveries, we're going to have congestion. We are going to have a reduction in safety, a reduction in quality of life. And so our goal at DOT is to make sure we are focusing on safety and quality of life. And that means we have to make sure our programs are planning for the urban freight that is here. And so that is something my office has been working on. As far as costs, there's costs for safety. If we don't ensure that we've accommodated that a delivery place for that truck, we hear a lot from community boards. Residents contact us who want to make sure there's less double parking of trucks so that they can feel safer as they cross the streets, right? So there are a lot of reasons why we should plan for freight, because then the other things that we want to happen will not work as well. So if we figure out how to plan them all together, the things that focus on livability will be able to be achieved. So when we've had some focus groups, one of the initiatives we've had at DOT after RPI kicked it off-hour deliveries, we had focus groups with other agencies. City DOT is managing infrastructure, but there are other agencies in the city that control other aspects. And we brought people together and said, what does a livable city look like to you? And they all drew sketches. There were no trucks in these sketches. Okay, there were plazas, and people were sipping their coffee in the plaza. The air was clean. There were birds flying. The sun was shining. So that meant we did something about the truck that is typically there, right? They liked transit, but still, no trucks on any of these images. That means we need to come up with a way to do sustainable truck deliveries in the urban center. And that's why we need to worry about freight, and that's why freight matters.
Thank you very much. Briefly about maybe the Delhi experience. What's urban freight benefits and costs for Delhi today?
Right, so we'll probably come to the specifics of Delhi during the course of the discussion. But, as I said, I recently started working in this area. And one of the reasons why it interested me significantly is because I thought about my life without freight. Right? So starting from the time I brush my teeth to the time I go to work, and the rest of the day, I figured doing all of these things would not be possible if the urban freight system was not what it is today. And I would almost be, not quite, but almost be living in maybe a jungle safari, not just for half a day or a week, but my entire life, if freight was not doing what it's supposed to. So it's very important. It touches the lives of each and every one among us, almost. And going beyond that, I think I'd just like to point out these figures. So 5% specifically about India, 5% of India's GDP comes from urban freight, almost 5%, 4.8 to be exact. We have about 2.6 million trucks, and it gives, just the trucking part gives employment to about 20 million people in the country. To put that in perspective, that's about 5 to 7% of the American population, and many, many more people. So for example, all the retailers, wholesalers, even the manufacturers, right? Eventually, if they have to be in business, freight has to be transported from the factories to the users. So it affects us in a variety of ways in our individual capacity as well as businesses. So I think that's a major reason to bother about urban freight.
Yeah, thank you. And Joe, more comments about your different experiences and maybe also on real estate and new developments in logistics.
Okay.
Warehouses in these big cities.
Okay. Just talking about cost, and when I've sort of spoken with freight operators in London and freight operators in New York, typically when they're delivering, they always raise the same issue, and that is the cost of parking tickets. There are some companies that are paying over £1 million or $1 million just to get access to the curb. And typically what they've done is, that's been absorbed into the cost of doing business. It's a particularly blunt tool used by city authorities to try and manage curbside activity and demand. And the cities need to do that. They need to be able to manage that curbside space effectively. But because there isn't a lot of space available and there's a lot of freight operators trying to get access to it, the manifest of that is typically a cost associated with parking. And so, where has that cost, been put on? Well, it's typically integrated into their business model, which is passed to the customer. And then as consumers, we're typically sort of paying for that. So that's certainly one thing. And then the other point is about, the cost of land is certainly an issue in the cities. And typically where in the past, if you go back a number of years, a lot of freight activity was generated in the city centre or just outside. Wholesale markets are an example of that. But as land value has increased, typically those organisations have sold up, they've been pushed out, they don't necessarily make particularly good neighbours, and so they have to move out towards the suburbs and further afield. And effectively what that means is, well, there's typically more trucks on the road. They're having to travel further distances from their distribution centres into the areas of consumption. And all these sort of factors are sort of, influence the role of urban logistics and how freight operators try and manage their operations on a day-to-day basis. But typically those day-to-day operations are working and they're very successful. I mean, the breakfast and the food that was here for the break, that got here on time. And so the system works. It generally is fulfilling what it needs to do. The question, I suppose, is whether it's as cost-effective as it can be and whether it's as sustainable as it can be.
I'd like to ask Alison, our first discussant, for this first set of questions.
Okay, first, thanks to the panel. I think you got very in-depth into this topic. Just drawing from a couple of the points that were made. So Stacy, at the very beginning, mentioned quality of life as being, freight serves the quality of life in the region, and Letitia pointed out that freight is driven by demand. Freight is a derived demand, and access to goods is necessary for a livable community, is necessary for quality of life in a livable community. And Nomesh brought up, what is freight to me? It means to start brushing my teeth in the morning, I have to have access to that toothpaste. And I think this is an issue that freight is just, it's constantly changing. Letitia brought up the need for flexibility in responding to freight. And I think, we talked about global markets and what's the cost to the region. My question here is, what's the cost to the individual of not having access to freight? So if I have an order from Amazon, living in New York City, I have the option of one-day delivery. I'm ordering at 8 o'clock in the morning, I want it by 5 o'clock that day. If that delivery doesn't come, what does that really cost me? Is it preventing me from doing business? It's reducing my quality of life because now I can't have access to that good in 6 hours as opposed to waiting a full day. So urban freight has to respond to these market changes that are happening. Individuals, we're not even just talking about businesses anymore. Stacy mentioned the bike lanes. In my research in the last couple of weeks, I've been looking at the locations where trucks are parked in bike lanes in New York City. I was expecting retail locations, and some of them were. The Grand Concourse in the Bronx, we have a problem in terms of access to the retail businesses. But probably more than half of the high violation locations were residential buildings. They were not large commercial developments. It's people ordering their groceries online, people ordering everything imaginable online. And that's because New York is a transit city, is a non-motorized city. We need access to these goods. Direct to home is the way to get it. I don't have a car to go to Walmart and buy cases of, soda or things that I can't carry from 2 blocks away. I get that delivered to home. So my question, I guess, for the panel is, how can we start to quantify and or communicate the value of this freight to the general public to get across the point that livable communities actually, the quality of life is heavily dependent on the freight system?
Well, let me mention an event that occurred last year, was during the holiday season, gets to the question of what is the result of not having a functioning system or a system that doesn't function well. Well, if you may remember, last year's holiday season, the season proved to be somewhat of a disaster for Amazon because some large percentage of deliveries were never made, and the business wreckage that fell out from that was on UPS, because this arrangement that UPS and Amazon had apparently didn't work out because they didn't anticipate the demand that was going to occur. I read recently that online retailing is something like 20 or 30% of the nation's economy. 20 or 30%. That's huge. And it gets to the heart of, well, with an increase in population, we're going to have more of this kind of retail activity. The urban freight challenge is going to increase if we don't really find better, more efficient ways of moving this additional material, these additional goods. But so, there's a cost to be paid here, and sometimes the cost to be paid is with the very companies that make up our economy.
And I think one thing that I think is out there is the number that reflects how much economic activity is lost because of congestion. I think in the New York region, and I think we lead the country, and I know in terms of bottlenecks, we definitely lead the country, but that cost is something in the range of 20 billion. But what we haven't done, Allison, that we want to do is really boil that down to what does it mean in terms of jobs and wages. And that's something that EDC would like to pursue, because it's something that Washington State has done, where they have surveyed manufacturing companies and shippers to understand, like, if there was an increase of 20% in terms of congestion and delay, what would that mean to your business plan? So if that's something that we want to take on to understand at a deeper level, really, what does it cost us, to the economy?
Okay, very interesting comments, because yesterday afternoon and it brings me to my second set of questions. We heard one comment from Gabe, who was giving the keynote speech, that actually the urban freight problem may in the future get resolved because of more local production for food or 3D printing, and actually a reduction in urban freight transportation. And you seem to think that, on the contrary, these activities will continue to grow because demand is changing, demand is growing for more deliveries, etc. So this is a very interesting comment. And actually, this brings me to my second set of questions. Actually, how is urban freight demand changing? I'd like to hear from the New York case. What are the New Yorkers in terms of consumer behaviors? And so I will ask Stacy that. How do you see New Yorkers in terms of their demands on deliveries and e-commerce and things like that?
Yeah.
And my second set of questions, and I hope everybody will give inputs on that, but probably Nomesh more, how is the supply changing because of these new demands? Are there optimization going on? Or is there such thing as new city logistics strategies or activities, innovations in the field of the supply of urban freight?
Okay, so what Allison shared, we are actually starting to see the UPS, more of these deliveries that are going to the residential areas. And normally we only put in truck loading on commercial corridors, so somewhere in front of a grocery store or in front of a retail store. But recently we got a request from a neighborhood to put in truck loading because of the number of UPS trucks coming to their building and having to double park, and they didn't want to have the double parking. So not only was I hearing from UPS about the parking tickets they were getting, but which is uncommon for us to hear from a resident to say, take away some parking so there would be less double parking. So I think some people are starting to get it. We put in a pilot of about 60 feet of loading, but because we didn't have wonderful enforcement, other people were parking there and we had to take the zone out. So I think once we bring in the curb management, better curb management as well, some of the public is starting to see that they are the one generating these demands to their residential area, and that those demands should be accommodated by the city.
Interesting. Do we have other comments about these new behaviors of consumers? And I heard Stacy and Alison mention residential deliveries many times today or over discussions.
Well, I mean, there's been a revolution in terms of places where people can go to shop. Just jotted down here This new phenomenon is known as omni-channel or multi-channel, where sourcing, where you have a number of different places you can go to. Simply going to a brick and mortar store anymore it's now it seems like it's kind of outdated. People do it, but what omni-channel means is that a company, a retailer that has stock in a warehouse, in a distribution facility, in a store, or perhaps having goods on order from a supplier, what that means is that you, as the consumer, now have all these choices. So if you are online and you see an item, no matter where it is, it could be at the brick and mortar store, it could be in the warehouse, it could be in the larger distribution facility. Now the retailer has to have all these processes in place in order to source that particular item and put the order together and ship the order and then get it to the final destination. And one of the things that we seem to be borrowing from our colleagues in Europe now is the whole notion of lockers as a place that would obviate the need for the delivery to the building, but still have a place that's convenient for the purchaser, place to go to where an item is delivered to an assembly of lockers someplace run by one of the integrated carriers, for example. And so, that would kind of begin to address a lot of these building issues, a lot of loading dock issues, building issues, curbside management, and that kind of thing.
Well, I think that's interesting there because I think if you went back in time, freight has typically responded to the market. The market has changed, retail market is changing, and freight is coming along and effectively supporting that. But I think with the situations such as the Amazon locker boxes type thing, you've got actually a freight solution which is being sort of sold as a concept, as a means of convenience, and trying to produce an edge to a customer to say, I can get you your product that you want at a time and location that's convenient for you. And so that freight system is actively supporting a demand, and it's a selling point.
How far can we go? Is this reasonable to ask to require same-hour deliveries, for example? And this brings new services of people on bikes serving, I know, people in Manhattan in 1 hour. How far can we go in terms of impacts on
We are seeing
safety?
people, certain grocery stores coming to us asking about incorporating freight cycles. So again, it's changing. So that will be a new thing for the DOT. Our bike lanes were designed for just a single bike, or not for freight cycles, which are wider. But the demands of the public, they want the groceries delivered to them. And the people who are running those stores are asking us, how can you help us incorporate freight cycles into our business plan? And so that is making us have to look at our city policies to see, well, how can we accommodate that? And so that's something that's emerging. We haven't finished that conversation, but it is coming because that's what the public wants. A lot of the public would like to buy it online and have it delivered, or go to the store, pick it up, and have someone bring it to their apartment.
And I think Henry Ford famously said that you could have the Model T in any color as long as it was in black. Right, that's not good and now people want specialization. They want, things to have customization. It isn't one size fits all. And for the urban center, what that means is we need some place to do this value-added warehousing distribution, where a product is different components come together and then are put together for to the specifications of an individual. And what we're seeing at EDC is this interest in fulfillment centers from these sort of major retailers like Amazon, who want to have a place where they can be close to the urban center and get it done, but it still has to be done at a price point that they can afford in terms of the land, the value of the land and the rent that they're paying. So that's definitely a trend that I think is going to be, it's good and bad, because it certainly will, we have lots of loft buildings in places like Brooklyn and the Bronx that need tenants, but at the same time, it's how do you sort of keep those areas from changing over to something else, particularly residential, while keeping them for freight that's very relevant to the New York City population. So maybe it's the drones, right? The drones are coming, right?
India has been using motorcycles for a long time, right? E-commerce players, in fact, use it all the time. Even beyond that, so we have, many households, even without a website, just calling up a store and asking delivery at home, particularly restaurants and grocery stores. So those people would come on bikes. And in fact, we are doing this survey among establishments in Delhi, and the results are very interesting. What we've found so far, and what our counterparts in Chennai have also found, Chennai is a city in the southern part of India, that more than 1/3 of the deliveries in urban areas are being done by motorcycles. And it makes a lot of sense. One reason probably is that trucks have a lot of restrictions for coming into the cities. Second, I think if you're on a motorcycle, it's very easy to penetrate the various small lanes and things like that. Parking is a major issue, and particularly in India, I'm sure other places also, it's very easy to park a motorcycle, right? Just wherever you find it, wherever you find the space. And there's another, when I think about it, I think intuitively when someone wants to deliver on a motorcycle, particularly in India, I think one more reason, one more incentive why they would do that is it's hard to locate addresses, right? We don't have well-defined addresses. And if I'm on a motorcycle, it's very easy for me to just stop, ask where this particular address is. And we like to say that every man walking on the road in India is a GPS, right? So people help very significantly. And you can do that several times. So typically when I also travel on my motorcycle, if I want to get from place A to place B, and if the Google Maps is not working well, I'll stop several times. And if I have a car that I'm driving, it's so much more difficult to do it, right? So I think that's one more reason why it works out very well for them. And so yeah, motorcycles is a major innovation, I guess, that people have figured out.
And just finishing maybe with Nomesh, I know you're working also on optimization of city logistics. Can you tell us more about your work results and how you apply that to Indian cities?
Sure. So now that we have e-commerce and next day delivery and same day delivery, same hour delivery and things like that, I think it becomes all the more important for e-commerce players to be able to optimize their routes so that they're able to meet the requirements and do it at a cost that is feasible to them. So in that sense, optimization becomes very important. And there are standard routing sort of algorithms available that people can use off the shelf, and new algorithms can be developed for the new requirements. But I think it has a major role to play if we were to continue with this bandwagon of e-commerce. Personally, I've also worked on optimization, and I can share a particular example of a major manufacturer of automobiles in Delhi, around Delhi. And they have what they call their milk runs. So a truck would go to various suppliers, collect parts, and come to the factory. We worked for them not as a formal project, but just informally through an intern that was working there. And we managed to save about 8 to 10% of their costs just by figuring out a good route of how to do a milk run. So I think it has a significant scope of being applied to supply chains.
Thank you. Howie, you wanted to?
I was just going to comment on a couple of things that I've heard. The notion of optimization and the comment that Andrew made about how they're witnessing more of the companies wanting to have fulfillment centers closer to within the center of activity. And I think it's interesting too, because on a global scale, there's the whole notion of nearshoring now. And that whole trend seems to be kind of taking off to a fairly large degree. The sort of rhetorical question I have is what's going on here with that? Does this really mean something? Is this whole idea of wanting to be closer to the action something that's going to increase in the future? And is that sort of a natural reaction to these issues that we've been talking about? And so maybe the solution is right there and just kind of needs to become more fertile, so to speak.
More final comments for this discussion? Would Michael share with us his comments?
Okay, well, I'd obviously like to thank everybody for the chance to take part. So very interesting discussion so far, and clearly some very important points. I suppose for me, sort of in thinking about it when we were discussing it, I mean, we want to go back one stage and think, well, if we've got two flows going on here, we've got the flow of things, the stuff that we started with, and we've got the flow of transport or vehicles. And these are matched up in very different and complicated ways, which we know about. And so if you take a street like a street in central London, Regent Street, then we've got 27,000 vehicles a day, of which at the peak, 35% of them are freight vehicles of some sort or another. So 5,000 vehicles driving down that street, 1,200 of them may be stopping to make a delivery, and 70 to 80% of them are vans. So that's a vehicle below 3.5 tons. So then if we go to this discussion here about the flow, I think we have to be careful about what we wish for in a sense, because if we transfer the flow of all these stuff into a flow of vans, there are going to be even more of these vans that need accommodating at the curbside. And if we think about the energy question about that, I mean, we already know that in travel and passenger transport, we have a ton of vehicle to move around, I don't know, a few £100 of person and some shopping sometimes. In a big truck, the equation's much better, actually. We've got a big truck, but it's got 20 tons of cargo in it. So this is a good deal from an energy point of view. Put all that in a van, and it's a bad deal from an energy point of view, unless we get into the question about shifting it all into electric vehicles, which we didn't really come onto in the discussion. So I think these patterns are really important and very, very difficult for planning to deal with, because you don't design this change. It just kind of starts to happen, and we know it's happening, and we've got some evidence of it, but it's not very consistent. And so even simple things like where to site the locker boxes can, for some countries and some cities, be really challenging. This is public space going to be used for the locker box, or I'm going to give you planning permission here, and that means you're going to want to stop here in your car to pick something up from the locker box. This is very complicated for people at the planning level. And if you go sort of to a more basic level, then obviously in the future we need to know all about where people are going to live, what they're going to do, and although we talk about retailing a lot, in the city, in many cities, things like office development is very important. And offices also, we've been doing some work on an office near to the university in central London. It's a multi-tenanted office building. It has something in the region of 200 deliveries a day. 200 vehicles turn up to deliver to that office. When it was previously owned by one tenant, it was a few dozen vehicles, maybe 30, 40 vehicles a day. And the future is much more complicated, because it's much more likely that the future are these very diverse sets of use, and these very complicated matches between the flow of things and the flow of the vehicles, and we need to sort of address that, and it's hard for planning to do that. So I suppose my question would just, I don't know if we have time for the question, but it's up to Leticia, of course, but just to say that, I suppose I was intrigued that we didn't make any connections often, or we don't make many connections in freight in this discussion, between some of the things we heard about yesterday, like Uber, and new business models built on technology, new business models which are built on technology, but built on kind of changing behaviors among people. But here we could have technologies that allocate curb space in real time according to some system which allows a smartphone to tell you that you don't give the millionth pound worth of dollar worth of ticket to somebody. We could do that. The technology is not so difficult to do, but we don't really do that. So my question would be, are we really missing a trick in the technology side, and who's going to take the initiative there? Or is it just that it's such a complicated system that it's very hard to make that sort of change?
And atomized.
Yeah. Okay.
Great question.
Well, I think one point that you make is very timely for us, because one of the things that EDC and the city have been challenged with is the fact that back in the 1980s, I guess, when national standards were set for truck sizes and lengths of trucks, New York City didn't adopt the national standard, and that played out where right now, the traffic law says you can't bring a 53-foot truck into the city. And we found quite directly through studies that we have been doing at JFK Airport for the air cargo industry, studies that we undertook with the Port Authority, that was having a direct negative impact on business expansion at JFK. And just recently, working with Stacy and with DOT, we published a rule change that would allow a new route to JFK that would allow for these trucks that essentially handle a fifth air cargo pallet. But that fifth pallet is the kind of efficiency that you want to see, at least for part of that truck move going from the airplane, to the ultimate destination, which is probably a distribution center. And that's hugely impactful. And again, it's hard to translate that to the public because the perception is you're adding a big truck to the system, and that's a bad thing, when in fact, I think we completely agree that is an improvement because it's more efficient. It means fewer smaller trucks on the network. And I think that is part of the thing that we balance all the time is the appropriate size conveyance, whether it's from the giant post-Panamax ship to the delivery truck that you want to be optimizing throughout the supply chain. And and greening, and part of that is also wherever you can, have an engine that's doing better, that's producing less carbon and less pollutants. So that's certainly our vision.
Yes.
So, Michael, you mentioned electric trucks and technology. And so one of the barriers to being in New York City is different agencies having control of certain infrastructure that would be necessary to implement innovation. So that is a real challenge that once resolved, then we could take advantage of some of these innovations. So one of the innovations that was brought to DOT was green loading zones. Could I get priority? This is the industry's question. If I switch to an electric truck, can you dedicate curb for us? So they're talking to DOT. We manage the sign that goes on the curb to say who parks here, but we don't control the highway lighting, electricity. We may put that pole up, but someone else has control over the electricity. And so if we also don't have camera enforcement of curbs, right? So several layers of things would have to be in place before we could even anticipate green loading zones. Great idea, but we would have to make sure that the infrastructure and the interagency collaboration or coordination is in place before we could even do something like that. So it should be in a long-term strategy, but it's not something we could do yet. At our agency, we have done pilots. We have a unit that does all the curb management, all of the muni meters. There's a unit that's their job, parking division. They've done pilots of different technology that would sense if a vehicle was in the parking space to sort of charge based on demand, using cameras, different technologies to determine if someone's there. So there are areas here that need further research to determine what would work here, and then figuring out how we would actually implement it, because we're not anti-innovation. It's just we have to have the structures in place to make those things happen. And we do have a unit within DOT that does alternative fuels, and they've been finding money to help fleets green themselves, and that is an area that we are committed to. That's what I want to say
Yes,
about
and that gives me a good introduction for the final set of questions, which is what about the new strategies for New York City DOT and all the other areas, public policies, and also I think we'll be very interested in your experience with reaching out to the stakeholders in the freight industry and how to work with them.
Okay, Joe, can I have that clicker? I had a few slides, if they could bring them up now, and I'll go pretty quickly. Okay, so this is an innovation. This is a bridge that the state was rehabilitating and putting in a brand new deck. And the city DOT, my office, collaborated with them to put a weigh in motion scale in the pavement. Their only request was that if I could get the scale to the site at the time when they were putting in this section, they would do it. I would just pay for the out-of-scope work that their contractor was doing, and we made it happen. And so now this is how you build credibility with the industry and the community, because industry has come to us and said, there are people coming in overweight. We want to be compliant with your regulations, but the competitor is going to beat us because they're going to come in overweight and make a profit. And so this was our commitment to both protecting infrastructure, letting the communities know we're going to be watching what people are doing, and then also trying to level the playing field for industry. So that's one innovation that we've done here in the city that was calibrated just in August, and we'll soon be getting the data. Bike lanes and truck loading. So I talked a bit about that. This is an area where we're still trying to build on our innovations. Delivery windows are what we've done. Anytime our agency is putting in a new bike lane or bus lane, we work together to make sure they accommodate some truck loading as a part of that project. And so the picture here, there is a truck loading area, and this guy, he's bringing in his product. He just so happens to be going parallel to the biker. But building freight, bikes, and BRT all, and building them all in, planning for all modes. This is an area where we still need some work. Freight and land use conflicts. We don't do the land use planning, we just manage the streets, but we go in and try to see what we can do to try to mitigate the impacts of oversized vehicles that are using some of the warehouses that happen to be right across from streets. And that, lastly, off-hour deliveries. This is a hotel getting a delivery at about 4 or 5 in the morning. So you'll see there's no one to compete with for the curb space. There are no pedestrians to be interfered with on the sidewalk. And this is something we think could really help with the congestion and the safety issues that we want to work on here in the city.
Many cities looking at this
Exactly.
area.
And that's it. So key
great.
things for
Thank
me
you.
are focusing on technology. We want to do more on technology for both managing what trucks are doing, protecting the public, and also providing a level playing field, and then doing innovations that help trucks get their deliveries in. Those that have to come in the day, let's accommodate them on the corridors, but let's promote also off-hour deliveries where they would be free to do what they need to do at the curb with no interference of other users.
Other comments for?
So could you bring up my slide? So what we've managed to do recently, and what this graph shows, is a profile of truck activity travelling to and from Manhattan and also central London. And the out of hours potential is significant here, because you'll see that truck drivers tend to get up and maybe a couple of hours earlier than most of us. They go to their warehouse, they get in the truck, and they drive into the city centres. And if we can do something with the off hours, which is making better use of the curbside space, not only for loading purposes, but for getting the trucks into those city centres, it's a very compelling argument. And so how can we actually do this? Because from a city perspective, this is good. If you can flatten that morning peak, spread the traffic out into the quieter hours, from a systems perspective, you're getting a much better utilisation out of the street and the road network. But there's a whole range of sort of complications associated with that. Does the truck driver want to get up an extra 2 hours earlier? Are the receivers going to be available to accept those deliveries? Is the truck going to generate a lot of noise and wake up, residents in the, when it's being unloaded? And so there's all these sort of complications, which is sort of suggesting that, maybe business does not want to change. And so off-hour deliveries, out-of-hour deliveries is really a behavioural change issue. The city can demonstrate, and as it's been done with projects and pilots in the past, is that it's more efficient for an operator to operate their vehicle when the roads aren't congested. It's better for them in terms of they're not using as much fuel. It's certainly more environmentally friendly because they're not idling their diesel engine in traffic. And so there's a wide range of benefits about that. And one of the issues certainly has been is, well, okay, how can you actually educate the freight companies to say, okay, you're operating this operation today, have you thought about this? Have you thought about making that change? And there have been some notable successes, both within New York City and London, and certainly during the Olympics of 2012, there was a relatively significant amount of change in the morning peak, when the Olympic Games were on. And certainly some of that delivery activity transferred to the off-hour periods. But to do this well, you need that engagement with the freight community. You need to be out there educating them, working with them, and to a certain extent, and certainly some of the things that have come out with the New York project is how can you incentivize people to make that change? Because they might actually have a cost, and that cost could be may be too significant for them to bear.
Thank you. I suggest we have Alison making comments, opening up the questions, and then we go directly to the questions from the audience, and the panel responds to the questions they
Yeah, and my
want to respond
this
to.
is probably more of a comment than a question. I think we can just sort of bringing back together what we just heard from the panel and almost going back to the beginning is that freight is complicated and involves a lot of stakeholders, and these new innovative solutions involve even more stakeholders than we were talking to before. So first, there's the public sector agencies Stacy mentioned. On the stage right now, we've got 3 different agencies that have a stake in freight that are represented. And this is not by any means the only agencies or the only offices within agencies that are working on these issues. So in order to allow these public agencies to try to make changes in policy, we have to demonstrate that these new innovative solutions are actually going to generate economic or social benefits for the city. If I want the city to offer, as is done in Paris, Letitia can speak more to this, there is actually space reserved in the central part of the city that is provided not for free, but at a cost equivalent to suburban space that allows logistics activities to happen in the center of the city. In order to make the case that that space should be allocated, we need to be able to demonstrate what are the savings in terms of space, in terms of emissions. Stacy mentioned cargo cycles. We just wrapped up a project looking at cargo cycles for freight delivery. In terms of space, if you replace a van with a cargo cycle, you're talking 300 to 400% savings in terms of the amount of space that vehicle is actually going to consume while it's performing that delivery activity. The second stakeholder we need to convince is the private sector. Private sector is not going to make a change in the way that they move their freight unless we can demonstrate that there is a financial benefit to them doing so. That truck driver is not going to voluntarily get up at 5 o'clock in the morning well, he probably is getting up at 5 o'clock. He's not going to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to make the 5 a.m. delivery unless there's an incentive to do that. And the off-peak study that Stacy mentioned, Jose Alganveras from RPI worked with Stacy on that study, was extremely successful for the companies in terms of producing major emissions savings, fuel savings. However, it only goes as far as the receivers who are actually willing to accept those deliveries. And so there needs to be some kind of incentive for them to do that. The third and newest stakeholder that comes into play here is now that we're talking about complete streets and designing the curbside, this is now also a multimodal issue. And Stacy mentioned her office is working, and I think in New York we do have relatively good cooperation relative to some other cities in terms of the bike office talking to the freight office to develop solutions that work for everyone. And just going back to the cargo cycle study, I want to give a very specific example that if we look at using cargo cycles in Paris, in London, and in New York, Paris was probably the first major city that has a large operation of cargo cycles. London did a pilot study, literally purchased their vehicles from Paris, the same exact vehicle. They shipped the vehicles over from Paris. In Paris, that vehicle is classified as a bicycle. It can go anywhere in the city that a bicycle can go. It can park on the sidewalk, it can access the bike lanes, it can go anywhere that a bicycle can. In London, that vehicle is a motor vehicle. It can only use motor vehicle infrastructure, it can only park in a motor vehicle parking space, and from speaking to the operator in London, they actually received penalty charge notices because the enforcement didn't recognize that it was a freight vehicle even though it was. So there's a complicated policy issue. Here in New York, we just finished our cargo cycle study. It's sort of ambiguous what it is. I would say, well, we can say it's a bicycle because in New York City, you cannot have an electric assist motor on your vehicle. So we have rules that really weren't made for these vehicles, but that prevent that electric assist motor. What does that mean? It means that instead of pulling 600 pounds on that bike, we can only pull half that. And so there are efficiency things with that. One other very local policy thing that prevents use of these bikes, the bike infrastructure, as Stacy mentioned, was designed for bicycles. On 9/11, after 9/11, on the East River Bridge crossings, they installed security ballards that narrowed the width of the bike lanes Now a cargo cycle cannot cross the East River. So any business that would be moving between Brooklyn and the Lower East Side, which we could probably say are high demand areas for bicycle-related activity, that can't happen because of those security bollards. So when we get to these innovative solutions, it's not like we can just say, okay, let's try the bikes. We have to convince the private sector, we have to convince the public sector, we have to convince the multimodal planners to accommodate these vehicles, and then we have to talk to enforcement about what is this vehicle and how do we enforce it. So I think that's, sorry, I probably talked too long there.
Perfect example.
But it's just a really good, complicated example of how difficult this really is. So I guess with that,
No, great. Maybe Michael, a final word, and then questions from everybody.
Yeah, just very short because that echoed a lot of things that I thought. I thought it's really important. This subject, it really matters. I mean, we've got to take it seriously, and we've got to be honest, we've got to do more about it because, going on as we are is not dealing with it adequately. And I think we have to be honest about that and recognise its importance and the need to address it. To do that, we have to push it further up the agenda, the point that Alison made. And I hope that, if they reprint the document like Complete Streets in New York, or if other people copy that kind of document, not in New York, sorry, in the US, if other people copy that kind of document, I hope that when you look in it, you'll find at least one reference to freight. The word freight doesn't appear in that document. The word delivery doesn't appear. And the word truck appears 3 times. But it means a food truck, not a truck making a delivery. And I think that's a missed opportunity in some ways because, as we've heard, it's all about sharing this capacity in a way that makes better sense from everybody. And we have to take hard decisions to do that and involve participation. But before we can do that, we do need to develop some of the basic things about how to design things and how to manage them. So I think there's lots of really encouraging examples, but there's a big jump to be made before we can sort of say we've really succeeded a lot, I think. So I'll leave it at that.
Questions for the last remaining minutes?
I'm Steve Brown with the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, and I thank my colleagues who I deal with regularly.
We'll bring you the mic.
Okay. Hi, I am Steve Brown from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And again, I thank my colleagues who I work with regularly and very cooperatively. One of the points that I wanted to make was that, and get some reaction, was that we talked about the complexity of urban freight within the urban environment. And in some ways, urban freight is maybe a misnomer because freight is global. And the urban part is one segment in a long logistics chain. And I know for the Port Authority, we've increasingly realized that we can't do the things that we need to do in order to make our facilities more productive unless we work with our partners along that logistics chain. And so in order to improve productivity at the marine ports that we operate, which are the largest marine ports on the East Coast, we have to depend upon the roadways that come into those facilities. They need to be productive. In order to extend the hours of that facility, we need to be part of a supply chain that also has extended hours. And so Stacy's work on off-hour deliveries and our hope for extending hours at the port needs to be accompanied by warehouses that are open longer hours. So we can't do it alone. We've worked with many of our partners. We've worked with the states of New York and New Jersey's DOT in creating a plan, a GMAP plan, Goods Movement Action Program. And we look forward to making these kinds of improvements. But I wonder just quickly, are there other examples that you could point to where national standards, where the globalization of the supply chain, the global nature of the supply chain, impact local decisions within the urban environment?
One thing, Steve, and we work very closely with the Port Authority, what we're trying to see is if we can follow more of the model that you have in Europe with things like short sea shipping and the movement, because we have, and one of our biggest challenges is that we have a interstate highway system that was built now over 60 years ago, and in some places even longer in New York. And adapting that or rebuilding that and adding capacity is extremely challenging. The most we can do is sort of repair and replace in kind, but there's not a lot of capacity. So one of the things that we are talking about is promoting use of barges or self-propelled vessels that would move freight, certainly along the Northeast Corridor by water, and bring them to terminals in New York. It could become part of a system. Right now, the economics is not exactly there, but I think we look to European examples where it has been successful, like on the Rhine, where you've got those great, relationships with the big ports like Rotterdam and Hamburg. So Steve, I think I know that's something that we'd like to see happen at places like Red Hook Terminal, where we have small marine terminals, but they can handle overweight cargo more efficiently, break them down into the local delivery truck, which is a green truck, go into the green spot at the curb. Yeah.
I think the term urban logistics, it does sort of tend to bring with it the externalities associated with freight. So a lot of urban logistics schemes are really sort of designed to reduce externalities. So, can they reduce emissions? Can they, do something about congestion? Do they improve curbside activity? And so I think you do get that quite narrow view when it comes to urban logistics. It's focusing on how can we do it better, safer, more efficient within the city environment, and what's happening overseas or further up the supply chain is maybe not too relevant, or it's certainly not considered within the decision making.
I think we're...
Okay. Hello, my name is Sönke Behrens from Gothenburg in Sweden, Chalmers University of Technology. Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. Mike, you mentioned we need to have a jump in something in order to really solve the problems. I wonder if we should consider regulations, more strict regulations. If we look at the passenger transport side, transit, it's heavily regulated. We subsidize actually the services because it's a public good, public service for society. Should we maybe think in the same way for freight? Should we organize public transport for freight in urban areas? Should we maybe even subsidize it? Have you thought about this, or is it something which is totally impossible from your perspective?
I think that gets put into the too difficult box, because and certainly having working in London to the US, there are different dynamics in terms of how should taxpayers' money be used, efficiently, and certainly within my perspective of working in the US. If that's a private freight operation, then really that is, that stands alone in terms of its economics. I think with Europe, it's a bit more different. The approach is slightly different. But I think from my perspective, that's always going to be a challenge. It's going to be a brave politician that is going to stand up and to sort of say, I'm going to put a significant investment into freight-related infrastructure that might have an efficiency benefit for a company.
I think, maybe before we start thinking about something as radical as what you're suggesting, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense either, but I'm thinking about the needs that the country has, the nation, as well as and more specifically the region, with regard to our basic infrastructure, our basic ability to deliver services and be able to allow supply chain entities as well as freight operators to better use the infrastructure that the public provides. So I had said at the outset, we have these issues regarding infrastructure condition, deficient infrastructure condition. I think one of the things that we could do is, in a sense, meet the providers halfway. And since they're using the public infrastructure, both on the highway side and in New York on the rail side, because as opposed to other metropolitan areas, our metropolitan area has a publicly owned rail system with a privately operated rail freight system. We're very different from other areas. I think we should need to meet the freight providers halfway, and at the very least, short of providing subsidies for services or infrastructure, let's provide the infrastructure that they need, that they can use better, more efficiently, and allow them to kind of germinate the services that they would like to provide, because we're providing, as a region, better infrastructure.
One observation I wanted to make is we should all realize that there's not one truck in New York City that wants to be here. We already self-regulate the trucks. They do not want to be here. But a very smart thing that the Port Authority is doing at JFK is building the first truck stop for the trucking industry, so that the trucks that are here because they have to be here because they're serving the air cargo industry, they have a place to go to get food, to take a shower, to relax a little bit between runs. So I think positive incentives, and there's other incentives that EDC gives through our Industrial Development Agency for companies that do freight the right way, is more of, I think, the way we would go rather than regulating.
Thanks. Great. Very short final question.
One quick question. All of what we're talking about, transportation, logistics, optimizing freight, changing the times freight gets delivered, that sort of leads towards the only way to achieve that, in my view, is if you undermine labor laws. Because really the reason a trucker is not going to get up at 2, not necessarily because if I'm the trucker I don't want to, because my employer doesn't want to pay me time and a half or twice. In India, that works because labor laws are weak. Most delivery persons are, in a sense, independent contractors. California has sort of moved towards that, with long-haul freight drivers becoming independent contractors so cities can impose time limits. So if you're going to impose time limits and not talk about labor laws, that's sort of a disconnect there.
So let me respond to that.
Yep. Stacey.
Okay, with the off-hour delivery project, we don't need 100% of trucks to switch to the off-hour to see an impact. Our goal is to get at least 10%. We can get that by people who volunteer. So we have not looked at mandating anything. It's been all voluntary. The companies who've been coming in want to, and a lot of companies are already doing off-hour. They start out in New Jersey and come here and make that first delivery at 5 a.m. because a lot of them could get $1,000 in parking tickets per month, per truck. So they were saving money in coming in the off-hour. The truck drivers were interviewed after the pilot project in 2010. They are very stressed in making deliveries during the regular hours. And I've been out with them. I've been out with home heating oil delivery, grocery delivery, in the truck with them, hearing the horns honking as we're double parked and no one can get by. That is not an easy job. So you don't need to mandate. If you could at least try to get to a 10% shift from a voluntary program that has some incentives, because they're already going to have an incentive by not getting the parking tickets, and that was the sole purpose some of them participated.
Okay, thank you very much.